One of the best areas where Epicureanism and Stoicism agree is on not worrying very much about what the common opinion is. And if you think that something is a good idea, yes, by all means, listen to other people and hear why they think that it's not such a good idea. But after having given it a lot of deliberation, if you still think that there's something different that would be a good idea to do, go ahead and do it. And don't worry about just fitting in.
Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros, and today I am speaking with Professor Bryan Caplan. Bryan Caplan is a professor of economics at George Mason. He's a New York Times bestselling author. He's written many excellent books, such as The Myth of the Rational Voter, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, Build, Baby Build, and we're going to be talking about his collection of essays today, Self-Help is Like a Vaccine. Thanks so much for joining.
Fantastic to be here.
So one summary of this collection of essays that I'm curious to get your reaction on is, in a way, you're sort of like a modern Epicurean, where the Epicureans, they have this emphasis on prudence, the pleasant life. They were known amongst other ancient Greek philosophers for sort of retreating to the garden instead of, fighting for glory or political prestige. So I think that maps on well, perhaps, to, your emphasis on appeasement, creating a bubble. And of course, Epicureans also thought that friendships were exceptionally important, and that was an essential part of their philosophy. And you talk a lot about that. So what do you think about that characterization?
I'm a huge fan of Epicurus. He's definitely my favorite ancient Greek philosopher. And I would also just say that per word of his writing that we possess, I think it's hard for anyone not to say he's the best per word. He just has, we only have about 10 pages of his stuff, and all of it's good. I think it'd be hard pressed to find any paragraph where you just say, oh, that's a pointless paragraph, doesn't do anything. Whereas you could be a huge Aristotle fan, and I think you still admit there's a lot of stuff that could be cut pretty easily.
Yeah, sure. That's funny. So another question I have here is, so people, they love giving advice. We love to consume it. We've had plenty of good advice from Epicurus, the Stoics, even some religious advice throughout the ages. So why aren't people more happy now?
Mostly people don't take good advice. This is what Epicurus thought, and it's what I think, which is pretty obvious when you'll notice, first of all, of course, there's just young people who haven't heard the advice yet. And then when they do, it's like, well, yeah, I don't feel like doing that. It's a very common problem. A lot of it comes down to human impulsivity. Stoics cannot be unaware of humans acting impulsively. We have a lot of impulses that maybe were functional in some distant prehistoric time, but now just don't suit the modern world. And we can get a lot of value just by impulse control, thinking a little bit. Even something as simple as wait 10 seconds before you respond does work.
Yeah. So you think it's mostly as simple as impulse control, mismatch between environments in the past or environments today. And you think those are the primary ingredients, or?
Yeah, I do. It's always tempting to go and blame the media or society. And then you realize, well, but this stuff is itself a response to human beings and what they're looking for. To go and say that we think stupid stuff because the media tells us stupid stuff. Well, why do you think they tell us stupid stuff? Because they think we're going to listen to stupid stuff. I guess you might say, well, the problem is the general nature of the consumers and I'm a victim thereof. All right, maybe that's the right story. But in general, trying to come up with some external theory of what's wrong rather than say the fault basically lies within the mind of the people who are acting it's a real cop-out.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It always seems strange to blame the media when it's largely driven by consumers, of course.
There's some sense in which it makes sense. You could say, well, it's not like anybody on their own would start becoming worried about shark attacks. It's some combination of people are just looking for anything negative, and then there's a business where they say, hey, we can make money selling them something negative. I don't know, how about shark attacks? So in a sense, you could say that if the media didn't exist, then many of the panics that we have wouldn't happen because there'd just be no way to coordinate on them. And yet still, it's not the media is shoving the stuff down our unwilling throats, but rather they're just trying to figure out, gee, we got so many great things to tell them. And which of the things should we tell them that will get the biggest reaction?
Yeah. What do you think about the theory that sort of starts out cynical, but maybe ends up in an optimistic place. The sort of thought that when people are looking for advice, they're not really looking for solutions for their problems. They're maybe more just consuming something they like to do. And maybe people's lives really aren't so bad. People mostly do what they want to do. There's plenty of sensible advice. They'd rather just not apply it because they feel like their needs are being met as things stand. What do you think about that story?
There's definitely some people who request advice but don't have any intention of listening to it. The advice that gets ignored the most, of course, is the unsolicited advice.
Yeah.
And yeah, well, it's not surprising that the unsolicited advice gets ignored. The solicited advice, I think that most people who actually solicit advice are in the market to go and get some advice because they're genuinely just unclear about how to act. Of course, I would probably, if you're saying what fraction of advice is solicited, yeah, it's probably at like 10, 15% of advice is solicited, and the vast majority is just unwanted advice. In terms of the reason why people ignore the unsolicited advice, I'd say probably the main reason people ignore the unsolicited advice is that it's not very good advice. Then as to why do people ignore the solicited advice, I think there it's more of it's too hard. It requires impulse control. When someone says, yeah, how can I lose weight before Ozempic? It's like, well, reduce calories, increase physical activity. Yeah, but besides that, those two things just sound really
Right.
painful. I don't feel like doing those. Yeah, but I wouldn't go with the Spenglosian story of people's lives are just fine the way they are, so they have no need to get advice or there's not much room for improvement. I do think there's just a lot of room for improvement. Even really simple things like learning about the sunk cost fallacy in economics, that improved my life noticeably. Like 1%, 2% anyway. And if just one very simple point that can be taught to an attentive audience in 5 minutes can make your life 1 or 2% better, well, that's a huge gain.
Right. Yeah, very good. So one way, or I suppose a common line of advice, self-help thought is to encourage people to be assertive and such. In a way, you cut against that by saying, look, it's appeasement that's underrated, not so much assertiveness. Do
Yes.
you think that's right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's very fair. I mean, I point out that officially appeasement never works.
Right.
Like all because of Munich. It's like, all right, so Munich didn't work out, but like nothing works out all the time. If you just look at the general policy of listening to what people want, and then if it's a token thing, just give it to them and see whether that calms them down. I think that is something that we're doing all the time, and yet there's almost no explicit defenders of appeasement. And what I wanted to do in those essays was to take a stand in favor of appeasement, say, look, it's really underrated. This theory that if you give in to people on anything, then they'll just start ratcheting up their demands to infinity, like Hitler. Like, that's just not how most people are. And a lot of it is that most people are not actually consciously trying to be parasitical or predatory. Rather, they have possibly in a very unreasonable way gotten it in their heads they're entitled to one very specific thing. And then if you just give them that one specific thing, which often doesn't cost you much, commonly actually really does shut them up permanently. So yeah, I think that's very underrated. I would say that there's a couple different senses of assertiveness. So there's there's assertiveness as aggressiveness, where there's someone who is in your face and you just try to escalate until they back down, and I think that really is quite overrated. There's assertiveness in the sense of just opening up your mouth and talking to people and seeing whether they would give you a chance. I think that still probably is underrated. I didn't have much dating advice in this book, but I've written 2 other essays subsequently, one called She's the One and another one called He's the One. And my most effective advice, I think, is if you want to go and ask someone on a date, just ask them. Think about it for 5 minutes about the best way to approach it, but don't just sit there paralyzed with fear of what if I'm rejected? It's like, well, if you're rejected, then objectively speaking, you're no worse off than you were before. Before you weren't with that person. Now you're not with that person. A little oversimplified. Maybe it will really complicate
Sure.
things,
Yeah.
but still, like the kind of person that would just hate you forever because you politely said, "Hey, would you be interested in going out with me?" I think that's real rare.
Right. Yeah. I suppose this is maybe a good case where of mismatch where perhaps when we were in smaller groups and such, things like appeasement would mean people would
Mhm.
extort you. Being
Yes.
rejected by a single
Right.
person would be terrible
Mhm.
for your standing. But in the modern
Mhm.
world, you're never
Yeah.
going to run as
Yeah.
that person on the bus again, or
Yeah. I
you know,
mean, plausible, though, of course, also the person who's super aggressive is
sure, sure.
that's another person that people don't like in a small group. And, I mean, if you're physically strong enough to back it up, then maybe you can get away with it, but the rest of us can't.
That's true. Yeah, appeasement is sort of, I think it's one of your quips, which is that governments do things that are bad that sound good,
Mhm.
or markets do
Mhm.
things that are
Mhm.
good that sound bad. And appeasement sort of sounds
Mhm.
bad, but
Mhm.
it does seem like a good strategy in many of our interactions. Do you
Mhm.
think there are other forms of advice in our social world that are have
Mhm.
that same shape, character?
I mean, just being really friendly to people, it's almost foolproof. Like the number of times being really friendly to people backfires, it's 1% less. Like the number of times that people fail to even say hello to another person that is actually useful to them, never mind that you might actually make a new friend. It is kind of shocking to me. Not really. Only I say only kind of because I was a kid once too, and I too was afraid to go and ask the waiter for the salt. You can really see this with kids where they want their parents to go and like get salt for them. Like, I want salt, but I'm afraid to ask. Like, what do you think could go wrong with requesting salt? Well,
Sure.
and I mean, you might say, well, if I ask in the wrong way, if I say, give me the salt, stupid, then that will cause problems. Like, okay, I suppose that could, but like, were you really thinking of saying the words, give me the salt, stupid? That would be a strange way to talk to someone.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Just to stick on this line of appeasement a bit longer, I think a lot of people are concerned that if you're appeasing with people, you're just being a pushover of some sort. You're not
Mhm.
sticking up for yourself in the right way, which I think is a mischaracterization, obviously,
Mhm.
of what you're saying. But
Mhm.
what is the heuristic or thought
Mhm.
for thinking like, when do I need to stick up for myself? When is a
Mhm.
conflict worth
Mhm.
having?
I mean, I would say, I mean, first of all, if there's repeated interaction, that's step one. If it's just one time, then I would almost always appease. But if it's
Mhm.
repeated interaction and if the person has a track record of responding poorly to generosity, and also if you think you're actually in a position where if you asserted yourself that you could actually get what you're looking for. I put those three things together. Those are cases where I think asserting yourself does make sense. But like normal interaction, someone bumps into you with a shopping cart at the grocery store. Like I always apologize over that, even when I think that the person was negligent, just because it's like, well, I'm never going to see this person again. And and then you like, and then there's also like, is it possible that I am the one done something wrong? That I am actually to blame here? Doesn't seem so, but what would a panel of just 10 strangers who saw all the facts think? Would they all agree with me? So that's another good thing to consider. And yeah, then finally, like, are you even in a position to be making demands?
Right.
Like if you're someone where you're totally expendable and the other person really could easily replace you, then it's like, well, I could go and assert myself, but probably just going to get fired over it. So, like a good way that I like to think about it actually is that by appeasing people, you increase your number of options, increases the pool of people that like you and would be interested in dealing with you again. And that is a much better way of protecting yourself from a bad situation than going and trying to have a confrontation, which I think often just makes things worse. Whereas if you just are widely known to a lot of people, especially in your profession, as just being a good person that's easy to get along with, then instead of having to get a big fight and then some hope that you win, it's like, well, I could just go and switch to one of my other options. It's also one where it does give you the confidence in the rare cases where asserting yourself does make sense. Say, well, if this really goes badly, I've got a lot of other friends and I could go and turn to them. And so I've got options.
Right, right. Yeah. Very nice. I think it's also related to argument that meekness
Mhm.
is underrated, right?
Mhm.
And that it's a core part, I think, of the modern
Mhm.
world, this
Mhm.
ability to get along
Mhm.
with others in different social contexts. Often we praise the iconoclast, the founder type,
Mhm.
but most people don't belong in that mold, or even the
Mhm.
founder type has many
Mhm.
places where they're not playing the incessant contrarian who's
Mhm.
trying to force their will on everyone else around them.
Yeah. And I say this not because I'm naturally meek, quite the opposite. And so you might say, well, there are some people who really are naturally meek and maybe they do need to get a little nudge to go and assert
Right.
themselves more. Yeah, I guess like people are like in the top 10% of meekness, I think I would advise them to assert themselves more. But on the other hand, people that are in the bottom 90%, like there's just a lot that you can get for yourself just in terms of just sheer prudence. It's like not being a tax on other people, not being a burden, going and listening and trying to understand it from other people's point of view. It does make people like you. And, as I like to say, friendship rules the world. You really want people to like you. Just from a totally selfish point of view, it's really good if people like you. Like, even if this particular person doesn't seem especially useful, it's like, well, it's another person on the menu who might one day have things work out.
Why do you think so many people promote this idea of the founder, the CEO, who forces their will on others and sees that as much more praiseworthy than perhaps the company man or the middle manager who is lower on the hierarchy, as it were?
Yeah, well, I mean, it makes sense that you would like to be the super high status person. You can see why people idolize them. If only I could be that person, then my life would be so great. But it's kind of like saying if I could be a professional basketball player, I'd be a multimillionaire. It's like, well, are you even in the running for that? Are you even the best player at your high school? And it's like, no, well, then I can understand your admiration, but it's also just not a realistic role model for you. And you might think that every person who's super successful, they just have a lot of useful lessons to teach everyone, regardless of how modest their ambitions are. And, open to that. All right, I'll give them a listen, but still it's important to distinguish between advice that's just generally good, like work hard and try to improve, from advice that's very specific to being someone who is the alpha, which is, like, get everyone to listen to you and and pursue your idea single-mindedly. Like, do you have an idea that good? I mean, most people don't. I mean, most people who start businesses don't even claim to have an original idea. There's, I think, a great NBR paper just trying to find out why do people have their own businesses. And mostly it's for autonomy and not because they think they've got a new idea.
Gotcha. Yeah, I suppose there's the thought, perhaps we don't praise ideas like meekness and appeasement so much because when we see ourselves acting as meek, that's evidence we're not the person in the sense that we want to be.
Right. And just in terms of impulse control also, I noticed that when I was raising my kids, I was reading them the story Mouse, which is this horrible Holocaust story. Well, it's a great story, but it's horrible. And they really didn't like the idea that just going and attacking the Nazi guards wouldn't work. They're like, why doesn't he go and attack them? Because then he'd get killed. But he could get a weapon. There's like, you're reading the same story as me. Do you see any weapons in the story? It's like, okay, well, there's got to be like, okay, like sometimes like you're in a really tough spot, and while like you're angry and you want to go and fight back, you just don't have any good way of doing it. It is it's very impulsively satisfying to hurt someone that's hurting, to hurt back someone who's hurting you. And then the question is, like, is it actually going to work? Which, as you mentioned, of course, it's a very Epicurean perspective, just looking at it from the point of view of prudence. And you might say, from, say, a Christian point of view, it's like not about whether it would work. Say, well, it's partly about whether it would work. At minimum, don't go and attack someone if it's going to blow up in your face. That's stupid.
Right. Yeah. I suppose you also have the Stoic line. I think Epicureans agree on this as well, that these sorts of acts shouldn't be considered in anger, because that's when you're just not as smart. You're just not thinking through things properly, are going to be blinded. So one other thought, or types of advice, perhaps self-help advice you give in the essays, is to craft a social bubble. I wonder if you could share more about that.
Right. I mean, so much of what people are suffering about is stuff where they actually have no control over it. People get upset about the news. They get upset about the political state of their country. They get upset about, the young people these days. And for all of these things, well, okay, you can't really do anything about it. Why are you getting upset about something that you can't do anything about? And it's like, well, what do you mean by can't do anything about it? And that's really where the idea of my beautiful bubble comes. It's like, well, in one sense, I can't do anything about the young people these days. There's just too many of them. I'm only one person. I'm not going to go and change what people under 20 are like. But on the other hand, what you can do is try to isolate yourself from things that bother you. And that is the idea of the bubble. Originally inspired actually by Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, where he had this survey set up basically to shame elites about how they were not part of real America. So that
Hmm.
was the original purpose of the surveys. Like, how many NASCAR games or NASCAR races have you ever watched? And then he knew a bunch of leads would say, I guess I never watched NASCAR. Like, did you understand that like 99.8% of all Americans have gone to a NASCAR race? Exaggerated. But anyway, like, aren't you ashamed to live in a country where you are so distant from what a typical person is like? Shouldn't you try to just be a regular, normal person in society? And that was a lot of the point of the survey. Really, it was to shame elites about their own elitism. I mean, it didn't work on me because, like, well, why should you be ashamed of that? Why is there this obligation to just be a regular person in your society? Why not instead lean into it and say, yes, well, I understand that these are the normal things in my society, but I've thought about it and it doesn't minimum seem like a good idea for me. Maybe it's just a bad idea in general. And then, and rather than trying to go and get rid of your bubble, why not try to acknowledge it and be mindful about it? Say, oh yes, well, I've kept out a bunch of things that I don't like from my life. Why not try to keep out a bunch more things? And then once you've done that negative task, then, well, what could I put into the bubble? So yeah, it's very much inspired by the Epicurean notion of cultivating your garden. So yeah, like, don't have people that really aggravate you in your bubble, and also try to make a lot more friends so that your bubble is not lonely. So I think I've seen one of the pieces. I'm not advocating purging people or defooing. You familiar with defooing?
I don't know what is
Yes,
defooing. I don't know what that
yeah.
is
To
actually.
defoo is de family of origin, right? So I
Uh,
believe Stefan Molyneux made the coined the term and got a bunch of parents upset at him because guess what? They got defooed by their kids after listening to Stefan Molyneux. But anyway, so I'm
uh,
not saying that, but just to let things go down to a lower level of commitment. So you don't need to actually purge people, but if there's a relative that aggravates you, don't go and try to start a fight with them at every family gathering. And yeah, maybe like also at the margin, you don't need to invite them to so many things if they're really that unpleasant. Don't make people feel like they have to choose. It's them or me. Then you wind up losing a lot of people that you actually would like to have. But that is the main idea, and I do try to put that into practice. I've got 10 steps for what kinds of things should you be doing. Um, but a lot of it is just sort of getting rid of this category of love to hate. Right?
mhm.
Or hate what you hate viewing, hate experiencing. It's like, look, it's true that it is a mixed pleasure, but I still say the pleasure overall is just swamped by the unpleasantness.
Yeah, I think that's there's certain pleasures that one shouldn't pursue, of course, either
Mhm,
because they have this
mhm,
sort of treadmill type effect. You
mhm,
have that pleasure initially, and you want more of it. You want more of it. You can't
mhm,
stop searching for it and such, or because, of course, they cause pains down the line, and perhaps
mhm,
a lot of so much news media has character
mhm,
like that, where
mhm,
it's not this sort of
mhm,
self-sustaining type pleasure,
mhm,
or it has, of course, worse effects down the line.
mhm. Quite
Yeah.
right.
Well, I think this is an interesting place because the Stoics and Epicureans agree on some lines of thought here, but disagree on others. So where they agree
Mhm,
is they think so much of the world is out of your control, and things like
mhm,
paying attention to national news. I mean, maybe it's important for some people, given their social situation, their
mhm,
role and such, but for most people, on the margin,
mhm.
they can do less of it.
Right,
Uh,
and especially when you realize that the news is not a statistically accurate representation of the world. The idea that you need to watch it to know what's going on, it's like, no. When you watch the news, you don't know what's going on. You know a very tiny, heavily selected and curated sample of what's happening on Earth with two enormous and well documented biases. One is just extreme pessimism, where the media is there trying to go and find the worst things happening on a planet of 8 billion people, which makes it really easy to find terrible stuff. And the other one, of course, in the US at least, is an extreme left wing bias. So you put those two things together, and it's like, yeah, like basically I get to get a very left wing, very pessimistic take on the world. And how is that informing me better than like just looking with your own eyes? As an economist, we're used to telling people don't rely upon anecdotal evidence. And I'll still say anecdotal evidence is super reliable relative to the news. Because, or, excuse me, not anecdotal, firsthand experience. Firsthand experience is what I
yeah,
really
sure,
mean.
sure, yeah.
Firsthand experience is much more reliable than news. If you're on just on things like how common is terrorism? Okay, well, according to the media, it's happening all the time. It's like one of the worst things in the world, and yet firsthand experience tells you it never happens, which is slightly exaggerated. But your firsthand experience is way closer to the truth than the media, where they would have you think that terrorists are lurking behind every corner, and there's totally not.
Right, right. Yeah, so I think the Stoic and Epicurean approach agree there. Where they might disagree is so the Stoics had this idea of what they called role ethics, where you have different roles in society. The fundamental one is we're all humans, we're all rational creatures, so we should pursue knowledge. But then we get more specific. You have relationships, some of them chosen, others unchosen, familial relationships, political relationships, and such. And they thought it was important for you to fulfill those roles. And a classic critique, of course, of the Epicureans is that they retreated to the garden and ignored these relationships. So how do you think about the arguments that the social bubble strategy doesn't take things like familial relationships, obligations to our neighbors and such seriously? How do you think about that kind of objection?
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, of course, I would start by saying, well, normally your family and your neighbors would be in the bubble unless they'd done something really objectionable.
Sure,
I
sure.
mean, I would start with that. I mean, there is the question of, well, suppose that your dad is unpleasant, but you're reasonably grateful to him because he did a lot of stuff for you. And it's like, yeah, well, prudentially, maybe you would be better off just paying very little attention to him. But still, like, prudence isn't the only virtue, and so there's some offsetting concerns. So probably I would just focus on that. And like, I'm not saying that prudence is the only virtue. I'm saying that prudence is a virtue and also is very poorly pursued by most people, especially with
Yeah, yeah.
regards to these things that you don't have any control over. Um, so I thought you were going to go in a different direction and just say, someone who retreats into their bubble and they ignore all the good they could be doing in broader society, something like that, right?
Yeah,
Where
yeah. Well, I think
everybody's
the first move I think you made makes sense, which is that at least as far as I stated the objection, it was a misunderstanding of the
Mhm,
view, which is not, it's
mhm,
not saying
mhm,
that you ought to
mhm,
say reject familial ties, neighborly
mhm,
ties, or whatever, just
mhm,
because you want to, or something like
mhm,
this. Like there's probably some threshold where, and I think
mhm,
the Stoics would agree with this too, where
mhm,
they wouldn't say you need to give your abusive mother a phone call every weekend or something like
yeah.
this.
Mhm,
There's some point where that tie is just not
mhm,
strong enough, and maybe Epicurean Stoics might disagree a little bit about where that point
mhm,
is. But
mhm,
this view isn't saying
mhm. Right.
that you shouldn't take
Mhm.
familial obligations
So you're thinking the
seriously as a
Stoics would at least be more
so
inclined to keep calling the abusive mother, despite the lack of
yeah, maybe
payoff.
so, or maybe a place where there's a little bit more disagreement was in the political case, where the Stoics thought it was important for citizens to be a good citizen. That was one of
Mhm,
the roles.
mhm,
They thought the Romans and Greeks, of course,
mhm,
thought this was very
mhm,
important. Whereas the Epicurean view is you could retreat to the garden. You don't need to pay
mhm,
attention about what's going on in
mhm,
the forum or something of this sort. So I think that's closer to where you predicted the question is going, which is that
mhm,
you have kind of role in your community to
mhm,
be doing good
mhm,
things. Maybe that's both an altruistic type role and also,
mhm,
you know, this community in some sense gave you the life you have and you have an
mhm,
obligation or a debt back to it. So those are sort of the thoughts that motivated that kind of view.
mhm,
Yeah. So what do you, I guess, what do you think about that version of
mhm,
the objection,
mhm,
which I think does make
mhm,
more contact
mhm.
with what you're
Right. I mean,
saying?
I would start with, like, do you have good reason to think that your participation would improve things? So that's a really basic question. Like, why exactly do you think that your views are so superior to those of other people that it's important for you to participate and share your views with them? And so just begin with that kind of self-reflection. Yeah, are my views really that good? That, like, do I really know that much more than other people? You might say the kind of person that would even ask themselves that question, the answer is almost always going to be yes, my views are better. So it's like, all right, well, at least we thought about it. So that's step
Yeah.
one. And then, second step is there's a lot of different ways that you could go and fulfill your obligations to be charitable. Why specifically is political participation the one that you're so focused on? Jason Brennan in his book, The Ethics of Voting, goes over, look, there's all these different ways that you might go and contribute to the world. And if you just think in terms of the effective altruist movement and their principles, it's like, well, yeah, it seems like participating in elections or in political discussion in general is probably one of the least helpful ways or least effective ways to improve the world. And like, probably at the other extreme, you've got earning to give, where you just try to get a high earning job and then donate a lot of money to proven causes like malaria reduction. So, I mean, and the idea that you need to do a little bit of each thing is in one where if you just read a little bit more widely in effective altruism, it's like, that's a really dumb way of thinking about it. It would make a lot more sense just to put all of your charitable energy into the one thing where you actually can do the greatest gain. Unless, of course, you are Bill Gates or someone so rich that your participation can actually flip the order of priority. Right?
Mhm.
But most of us, you could put every charitable dollar you're ever going to spend into malaria nets without changing the ranking of malaria nets on the hierarchy of valuable causes. Whereas, Bill Gates, he might really be rich enough that he could actually donate so much, like, oh, gee, I solved malaria. Now what? But almost none of us are in that situation.
Right, right. Cool. Is there anything else you wanted to say on the social bubble strategy, or
Hmm.
any other advice from that long
Like
list?
I'd say it requires a lot of self-control because our inclination, you're not physically isolated. Rather, it's just setting up a psychological barrier between yourself and bad things in the world, which means you still do encounter it. And people are very tempted impulsively to go and participate and to get involved in a way that upsets them without really improving things very much. I mean, like also just notable how, like, what are the odds that if you went and participated in the dialogue that you would change anyone's mind? This is definitely a triumph of hope over experience. How often do you actually change anyone's mind on anything? And yet people keep arguing. And then, especially when it's like, so did you even imagine that what you're saying could persuade a person? Like any time that you see someone on social media
Sure,
saying,
sure,
what
yeah.
you fools fail to appreciate in the whole history of humanity, has any monologue beginning with what you fools fail to appreciate ever changed anyone's mind? Like, it's been a long time. A lot of words have been spilled. So I suppose it's worked at some point, but like in your own firsthand experience, does this ever work? No, then why are you talking to people in this way, which upsets you and antagonizes them? Like, why not go and try to do something positive?
Yeah, yeah. So one key part of the social bubble strategy, of course, is sealing yourself off from a lot of these distractions, I suppose, like social groups that engagement in whatever their activity they're doing, whether it's politics, gossip, or what have you, makes your life worse.
Mm-hmm,
But the other part, of course, is that cultivating your garden aspect, which
mm-hmm,
I think does involve a serious amount of
mm-hmm.
intentional efforts to do
Yeah.
well.
You're thinking about gossip. Like one of my favorite questions to ask friends when people would be gossiping is, so what good is happening? What good is happening? Tell me something good that's happening. Or when my daughter says, how was school? Fine. What happened? Nothing. And I said, tell me the best thing that happened all day. That is, I think it's just a really good way to shift the conversation, get people thinking in a positive way, and then they share something positive with you and you feel better about it. Some a much better way of interacting with other people.
Mm. One of the switching gears a little bit, I suppose, one of the things Epicurus, many of the other ancient philosophers talked about is one of the keys to becoming happy was facing the fear of death. So how important is that
Mm,
to your worldview?
mm.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my mom just died recently, so I was just
mm,
at a memorial service and I've been thinking about it a lot. I mean, I know there's some people who feel like they actually can get at some level of peace just by thinking about death. Obviously, it's much easier if you think that there are some afterlife rewards and things are actually going to improve for you, and there's a bunch of people that you miss that you're going to get to see again. I just think that's wrong and it's just total wishful thinking. Um, like the main thing that I do think about actually is, and no one take this the wrong way. uh, so don't be afraid for me. You shouldn't be. But I do think a lot about when my life becomes hopeless, when I am in constant pain and I know that nothing's ever going to improve for me, then I am very big on suicide as the best thing to do. Right. And so there, I would say that Epicurus' point about how, like you're not sitting around miserable, that there was a long time before you existed. Why you should be so miserable if there's a long time after you exist. All right. There's something there. Still, I wouldn't say that it actually gives me any big comfort. I mean, I do get comfort just from knowing I never actually need to live in agonizing pain for years, except in some very rare circumstances. I never need to go and put my family through seeing me with severe dementia. I just
mhm.
have to plan ahead and be prepared. So that does give me a austere sense of comfort. I'm not saying I'm like jumping for joy or anything like that.
Sure, sure.
Like I would very much love to have healthy life forever. I love the idea of life extension. I haven't been sold on any of it actually working. My best friend, Robin Hanson, has a whole cryonics contract. When he walked me through his reasoning, most of us came down to he had a very low standard for personal identity, to the point where it's like, well, why don't you just say that as long as people keep reading your books, you're still alive? And then that's immortality, because his version of immortality, to my mind, was really no better than that. So like, I'll upload myself into a computer. It's like, best case scenario, it's a copy of you. It's not you. And he's like, no, it's
Right.
still me. But like, no, it's not.
Yeah. Why do you care about the upload?
Mm-hmm.
Why think has any sense of personal continuity with
Exactly.
with you? Yeah.
That's a running argument I have with Robin of mental continuity as what it means to have continued existence, not similarity. Yeah. So you sound like you've got a very deep background in philosophy. So, type identity versus token identity is a idea I've never quite got across to Robin. As an engineer, it's like, well, what difference does it make? Everything, like, as long as you got type identity, who cares about token identity? It's like, you should care if you're the token.
Yeah, I think there is a kind of person who does prefer type identity accounts of just about anything.
Yeah.
And
Like from the, like if you're like an engineer designing a machine, it's like they're interchangeable parts. What difference does it make? And, as we know from Nagel, there's no answer to the question, what is it like to be a brick? So yeah, like two bricks, they're identical, whatever. They're like, it doesn't matter to them. But on the other hand, if you are a conscious being and like you either you or your copy can be saved, yeah, makes a huge difference.
yeah, I think so. I think that's right. The Stoics also had the same view about suicide as well, where it's they have this. Epictetus talks about the open door. He says, "Look, suicide is in a sense always an option. Whenever you're experiencing a given pain, there's a sense in which, and it's always a sensitive matter and difficult to know how to put this, but there's a sense in which by choosing to continue to exist, you should take some comfort in the fact that I'm choosing to do this for a reason. I know it's going to end, and I'm not taking that open door. I'm not taking that option, which is always available.
And of course, Epicurus has the same thing where he's arguing with people who say life isn't worth living, and he says, well, just to modernize it, like, look, there are a lot of high cliffs here in Greece, so and the fact that you haven't done it shows to me that you don't even believe what you're saying. So why should I keep arguing with a person who doesn't believe his own position?
Right. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so needless to say, like, if you're young and upset, don't kill yourself. Right? Almost certainly it will pass. Right? There's this great scene in the movie Little Miss Sunshine where there's the grandfather who's a drug addict, and his grandkids find out, and he says, "Look, don't do drugs. At your age, it's crazy to do them. At my age, it's crazy not to."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it goes back to this point about impulse control, and such. I think, especially important. I think for younger types to know. It is crazy to be thinking about at their age.
Yeah, all of the youthful suicides I've known seem like terrible mistakes to me. But on the other hand, psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, he killed himself because he was in a horrible medical situation, and he wrote about how he would do it, and he did it. My hero.
Yeah, I think Szasz is certainly underrated as well. And you have a very nice paper on him, I should say.
Well, thank you very much. I liked it, and he liked it actually, which really made me feel good. That I thought he might dislike it, so I was like, he might not like the way an economist is trying to reformulate what he's saying, but he was on board.
Yeah, I think it works well. Preference and budget constraints is a good way to put a. I'll often recommend that essay to people who want to know about Szasz, but maybe have a hard time getting into his work.
Yeah, the books of aphorisms are actually best. So I think anyone who likes the Stoics or Epicurus will appreciate The Untamed Tongue, which is, he actually wrote a bunch of books of aphorisms. I say that one is the best.
Yeah, The Untamed Tongue, Words to the Wise, also quite good. Since we're on this topic and listeners might be interested in Szasz, in terms of self-help, I know it's a big question, of course, but in terms of self-help or ideas that are Szaszian in this most recent book, Self-Help, Like a Vaccine, what would you pick out if you were to sort of locate his influence in the work?
Yeah, actually, the title essay. So the book is called Self-Help is Like a Vaccine. That's just the title of the initial essay. And it begins with one of my students, Andrew Biggs, writing during COVID saying, oh, no, Andrew Briggs. Sorry. Either way, I'm sorry, Andrew. But in any case, just saying, look, people that are overweight Americans, they know they're endangering their lives and that their COVID risk is much higher, but they just can't stop. And I said, look, none of the facts that you presented shows they can't stop. It shows they don't stop. Doesn't mean they can't stop. There is a world of difference between can't and don't. And what we can say is if someone does something, we know they can. But the fact that someone doesn't do something does not show they can't. That was the main point of the essay, is saying that it's very important to distinguish these two things and then it's like, well, how could you even tell the difference? It's like, well, one thing that I say in my Szasz essay is the gun to the head test. If when the incentives get really strong, does behavior change? Again, I'd say, even then I would say, well, that doesn't absolutely prove that they couldn't, but at least it's interesting to know. And then I say, look, if you're willing to go and take these I just can't kind of excuses for all this other stuff, why not take that kind of excuse for people who have vaccine reluctance, which was at the time, of course, a huge issue. At the time, people were heavily moralizing vaccine reluctance, saying you horrible, ridiculous fools, you bad people, and no one was willing to say, look, I just can't do it. It's like, obviously you totally can. Just stick your arm out and don't run away when you get injected. You can. So yes, so that definitely was a big influence. And there's a few other essays along the same theme. It's very popular for people to say, I can't, when what they really mean is I don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
This is something I've been pushing. There's the psychologist's notion of social desirability bias, which just says when the truth is ugly, people lie. People realize that, for example, they say, oh, do you want to come to my party Friday? Oh, I can't. All right. Can't doesn't really mean can't. You're not going to be chained to a wall. You're not going to be on Mars. It's really just a polite way of saying I don't want to. But then what about when someone says I can't stop drinking? Well, why don't we think of that as being akin to I can't come to your party rather than I can't lift 10 million pounds? And I say, yeah, it is a lot more like that, which again, we can just see from how people change their drinking behavior when they're being monitored or when they're worried they're going to get divorced if they don't stop drinking.
Right. Yeah, I think people haven't completely internalized the fact that people change their behavior when the price of alcohol, the substance change.
Yep.
And then, of course, as you say, there are social consequences to drinking. People do change their behavior. So I think that is significant evidence against some of the more determinist type views about substance abuse.
Yeah, but a lot of this is closely related to medicalization of human behavior. And what's striking is most people refuse to medicalize most stuff. For most stuff, it's still matter of choice or moral condemnation. But then there's this strange list of stuff where you stop saying it's a choice. You stop going and criticizing the character of someone who does it and just say they can't help it. And that's, of course, inimical to improving things. And so if you just realize that we have a tendency to understate how much is in our power, that means that you are understating your ability to improve your life.
Yeah, and it can be especially harmful for the individuals in question. I think start changing themselves.
It is an excuse for why you keep doing the wrong thing. It's like I can't do anything else. So if you're not planning on changing, then it is a convenient claim to say that it was outside of your power. But on the other hand, maybe you would have actually fixed things if you really took seriously how strong your agency was.
Yeah. I do think those Stoics are very good on agreeing, and they have sort of a radical agency. What's up to you, and how you think essentially, and your beliefs. Of course, just are composed by your judgments, your decisions. Those are completely up to you. Everything else that flows out that's outside, and in a sense, it's not ultimately up to you. But your decisions, your judgments, essentially how you think. That's you have the power over that. One question along these lines that I'm curious to get your take on is: it seems like medicalization, in particular, is a way of conflict avoidance. where you just have
Mhm.
the adolescent with mental health issues. Those are medicalized such that the family in a way can just out put whatever behavioral issues they're having with their child out to some third party without
Mhm.
having a large blow up in the family. Likewise for many
Mhm.
substance abuse
Mhm.
type cases, and it's a way of
Mhm.
not facing problems directly, but perhaps that's in many cases that's not so bad.
Mhm.
It's good to avoid some of those direct conflicts and get a third party involved. What do you think about that?
Hmm. Well, I mean, going back to appeasement, I was saying appeasement makes the most sense when there is some small, discrete demand someone's making.
Hmm.
It's like, all right, just go and say it's not a big deal that we took East Timor from you or something like that. It's in Indonesia. It's just like half of an island. Who even cares? All right. We're just like, give it back. It's like half of an island. What's the big deal? Right? I mean, I think a lot of appeasement, so, the case for appeasement is strong when there is a minor, highly symbolic demand, which often has to happen in real life. So like, just apologize for stepping on his foot. It's like, well, he stepped on my foot too. It's like, still just apologize for stepping on his foot. The cases that you're talking about are ones where people wouldn't even be thinking about outsourcing it to a third party in the mental health industry unless it were a severe problem. So I think, those are cases where the appeasement is just a lot less effective and really does have big downsides. If you just say we're just going to put up with someone with a severe drinking problem as long as they go to AA meetings and they've relapsed 20 times, and it's like, yeah, that's where I would say, don't, stop appeasing in that case. Uh, I think actually one of the essays here, I think it is in Self Help is Like a Vaccine. There's I just make the point of, imagine that you've got a neighbor and they have a brother who's a habitual alcoholic and they let them sleep on their couch 20 times, but each time they go and they trash the place and steal money.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then finally your neighbor cuts off the person, the alcoholic relative, and says, you're not welcome here anymore. Right. Would you condemn your neighbor knowing nothing else? And it's one where it's like, would I do that? Or would you, like, maybe you would have given them more chances, but do you really have the confidence to say that neighbor is terrible? 20 times is nowhere near enough times. And it's like, I think you'd have to be pretty crazy to say, yes, definitely the neighbor's in the wrong. And they should just keep putting up with this kind of bad treatment from the other person. Right. So in that case, the idea of a person saying, look, I just think I've done enough and I don't want to do any more is reasonable. But then if there was someone who says, like, I think that I've paid enough taxes to go and solve poverty and I don't think I should have to pay anymore, that person generally does get harshly condemned. And it's like, look, well, at least listen to the person. Maybe they have done a lot. And like, why are you so quick to take the side of other people over this person? Maybe the person has already paid millions in taxes and they don't think they've seen much improvement from it. And their patience is at an end.
That's funny. Um, so many intellectual types are drawn to a kind of uh, hatred of humanity, I suppose, of one
Misanthropy.
kind or another.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
how do you
that's even,
defeat that?
that's even what I'd say hatred of humanity is even stronger than misanthropy, but yeah,
Yeah.
whatever the word for hatred of humanity is.
Yeah. Well, how do you defeat that? I think it's something
Mhm.
that's very common
Mhm.
amongst, of course, many famous
Yeah.
intellectual types, but also a
Mhm.
tendency in
Mhm.
younger people to get interested in
Mhm.
philosophy, perhaps, or
Mhm.
questions about politics and such. A kind
I
of
mean, I think I would
misanthropy.
just start by saying, even if you're right, it's not a constructive strategy to act on. You should be focusing on finding the good people that you do get along with rather than condemning people you don't get along with. I mean, I would say, look, suppose you're right. Suppose 99% of people are terrible. Still, it is not productive for you to spend time talking about how terrible they are. What's productive for you is to go and try to find the 1% that are not terrible. So I would start there. But besides that, I think I would go. Let's see. I think it is actually Epictetus who has no. It's Marcus Aurelius actually who has this list of exercises for how to go and feel better in society, and some of them are consistent with the misanthropy, like saying, "Wake up every day and say that I'm going to hear a bunch of unreasonable stuff and unfair stuff, and just to get ready for that." But another part is like, could it possibly be that I'm the person who's being unreasonable and unfair? What is it exactly that they have seen that has made them that way?
Hmm.
If I were in their shoes, would I really act so differently? These are also other very reasonable questions. Or, it's like, what exactly is it they're doing that's so awful? Right. And often in today's society, it's like, well, they have some terrible political views. Like, well, do they actually have any power? Are they ever going to have any power? Like, no, it's just some nobody. and I don't like their political views. It's like, well, why don't you think about the things that they do that do make a difference? Maybe the person is a wonderful parent. Maybe the person is a loyal worker. Maybe they're a good friend. So before you go and just say that person is on balance terrible, why not go and at least do a full inventory of the main good things and the main bad things they're doing? And keeping in mind, like, do the bad things they're doing even matter? Do they even change anything really? Or is the person just a nobody? I think that does wind up giving you a much more favorable picture of human beings, because most people's main thing is not just going and spouting stupid political views. Most people, they got a job, today. So even today, most people do have had kids. Most adults, will or have had kids. It's like, well, this person is someone that allows another person to be born and to be raised. Even when you see someone, there's people that I know, like, I don't really like that person very much, but that person's the only father that kid has. So it's like really good for that kid. And like, the kid hasn't done anything bad, really. He's just a normal kid. Like, why would, don't you want that kid to have a father? It's like, so like, that person's doing one really good thing just by being that kid's dad.
Yeah. It's always a good reminder. Do you have any thoughts on Stoicism? Well, have you heard anything you want to share to Stoics, or people inclined towards that philosophy?
Yeah. A lot of what I say, the overlap between Epicureanism and Stoicism is so strong, there's barely any difference. I would say that the stuff in Stoicism that seems odd or wrong to me is just like not actually trying to enjoy things that are right in front of you and just depriving yourself for no real reason. So now, like, maybe you would consider that unfair, but maybe it is. But it does seem like there is not a lot of effort in Stoicism to just try to enjoy life as much as you can, which I would always encourage people to do. Well, not always, but like generally encourage people to do. And like, aren't there a lot of really enjoyable things that you could be doing? And have you done those things? The focus on duty, I think, is fine, but I think that probably Stoics have what seems to be an exaggerated sense of all their duties. So the list of duties and the intensity of the duties just seems implausibly high to me. This is one where there is just a clash of intuitions. Why is your duty so strong that it will require you to abstain from so many of the good things in life? Do you have any particular specific decisions or moral issues where you think the two of you give different answers?
Well, maybe one concrete historical case is you have Stoics in the Stoic opposition against Nero, taking a hardline stance against essentially who they saw as a tyrant, and they were willing to put their lives on the line. Not willing to appease Nero's performances, doing things that would obviously get them either exiled or worse. So I think that might be one example where the Stoics just take the hard line. You think,
yeah. So, I have a lot of sympathy for that. I have watched the movie Valkyrie about von Stauffenberg, and it's a very accurate, historically accurate movie many times. Right, that's the kind of thing where maybe I would try to talk my sons into going and killing Hitler with me, because we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it, and we're going to come up with a much better plan than anyone else is likely to do, and we've got a lot of follow through. So let's go ahead and kill Hitler. That seems like a case where it's worth going, and the gain is so great. And yes, you are plausibly giving up your lives for this, but it's such an enormous gain. On the other hand, when it's a very token gain or a symbolic gain, that's one where I would say that, well, look, I'm just not going to go and drink one glass of wine because that violates a Stoic principle. I don't know. Are there any Stoics who will refuse to drink a single drop of alcohol in order to go and get some great good accomplished? I'm not a drinker, but
for alcohol in particular, no, I don't think so. Some Stoics were actually known for, like Cato the Younger is known for being quite the drinker, apparently. So alcohol in particular, perhaps not.
It's odd, right? Because you say you're especially being a heavy drinker, you're much less likely to fulfill your duties when you're under the influence. And what are you getting? Mere pleasure. Honestly, I will say, pleasure in general. I've enjoyed it a lot, right? And if someone is in a situation where they could go and without having any other effects, just make their life more pleasurable, I'm like, it does seem odd to me to say no. I mean, really, like the only case where I would be inclined to say no is, should Hitler, while he's awaiting his execution, go and enjoy a game of chess or something like that? It's like, no, you should suffer, right? You need to do penance for all of your evil. But it's just some normal person. It's like, should I sit here and be bored, or should I go and I got nothing else I could be doing, or should I go and try to do something I enjoy? It's like, yes, by all means.
Perhaps Stoics do have more of an emphasis on self-mastery or something like this, or smaller decisions like this. But I should also ask, is there anything else you wanted to touch on before we hop off here? Any other important ideas you think?
Yeah, there's a few other things. So, one is, it hasn't come out that much, but I am an economist. So a big part of what I wanted to do in this book is to rethink economics as a body of self-help and not just a body of policy advice for governments. I know there's some economists who just hate the idea of economics as self-help because they have the idea everyone's optimized already anyway, so that we have nothing constructed to help people. And my reaction is like, why would you sell your field so short? Telling people to walk out of a bad movie because either it's just like suffering for free, so why not do it? This is good advice. Never mind things like get a diversified portfolio of investments for retirement. That's also good advice. The other thing is that 1/4 of this book is on homeschooling. I am a homeschooler. I homeschooled my older sons from grade 7 through 12. And then during COVID, I was homeschooling all of my kids. This is another case where a lot of people don't do it just because it's weird. And I said, if you're concerned that society will go and mess up your kids' lives because you did something weird for them, then that's something to consider. I think the actual evidence is that the discrimination of the world against homeschoolers is now quite low. And if you use the extra flexibility of homeschooling to excel, then I think you can, that it's easy to actually to make homeschooling a net positive in terms of success. So, and again, I would think about, one of the most useful or one of the best areas where Epicureanism and Stoicism agree is on not worrying very much about what the common opinion is. And if you think that something is a good idea, yes, by all means, listen to other people and hear why they think that it's not such a good idea. But after having given it a lot of deliberation, if you still think that there's something different that would be a good idea to do, go ahead and do it. And don't worry about just fitting in. So homeschooling is one example of this. I actually met a dad and son in India where he told me that it was one of my essays to convince his wife to let him homeschool his son. So I was like, all right, great. And he's saying, yeah,
very cool.
It's really unusual in India. Hardly anyone in India is homeschooled. And he wanted to give it a try. So this was a way of saying, yes, well, I understand there's a lot of objections to it, but I've thought about it a lot and I think it's a good idea and let's move forward with it, even though it's unpopular.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I was homeschooled up until high school, and I thought it was a good way to spend my hours as opposed to in some elementary school somewhere.
All right. And I guess the one other thing is you can get both the paperback and the ebook on Amazon. So it's real cheap. I haven't raised prices despite inflation. So it's $12 for the paperback and $9.99 for the ebook.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure. Great talking to you.
Thanks for listening to Stoa Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.